Bienvenidos a esta actividad ofrecida por la Comunidad de Práctica de Competencias de Información e Investigación de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Para mí es un placer estar aquí presente, participando como moderadora en este cuarto Encuentro Nacional de Competencias de Información con su segunda jornada virtual titulada Metaliteracy, Engaging Students through Assessment as Learning. Así que en la mañana de hoy podrán tener la oportunidad de disfrutar una excelente conferencia por dos excelentes ponentes. Pero antes de comenzar, vamos a iniciar con los saludos, comenzando con la doctora Ivette Maldonado, facilitadora de la Comunidad de Práctica para el Desarrollo de Competencias de Información e Investigación de la Universidad de Puerto Rico.
Sí, buenos días. Nos complace comenzar hoy a celebrar la segunda jornada del cuarto Encuentro Nacional de Competencias de Información. El lema del encuentro es Avalúo del aprendizaje, aplicaciones, instrumentos y prácticas en el desarrollo de las competencias de información. Este encuentro se celebra cada 2 años, comenzando en el 2014. En esta ocasión el Congreso se celebrará o se está celebrando de manera virtual y no todas las actividades serán el mismo día. Les invito a inscribirse en este canal para que reciban las notificaciones. Las actividades quedarán grabadas, así que pueden repetirlas o recomendárselas a cualquier colega. Más adelante publicaremos en el canal los videos del segundo y del tercer encuentro nacional. El segundo fue sobre experiencias de otros bibliotecarios y profesores en la integración de las competencias de información. Y el tercer encuentro que fue sobre el marco de la ICR para el desarrollo de las competencias de información. En esta segunda jornada hemos establecido como tema, hablemos de avalúo, definición, aplicaciones y evidencia. Hoy comenzamos con un conversatorio con dos exponentes estadounidenses que son personas a quienes debemos el Framework for Information Literacy on Higher Education, el famoso marco para la alfabetización informacional, sent to Professor Trudy Jacobson and Dr. Thomas Maki. It is a pleasure that you have agreed to share your vast knowledge with us. Espero que disfrutemos esta actividad. Luego de esta actividad tenemos otras 4 que van a ser el 1, el 5, el 12 y el 26 de marzo a la misma hora. Para todas las actividades hemos invitado a 9 oradores. Algunos son de Puerto Rico, otros de Estados Unidos. Todas las actividades son a la misma hora, a las 10 de la mañana. Van a estar trabajando con el tema de avalúo y algunos con competencias de información, pero todos los temas tienen que ver con avalúo. Contamos con recursos de la Administración Central de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, una de la empresa privada y pues los recursos de Estados Unidos. Estén pendientes a nuestros medios de comunicación para las próximas 4 actividades de la segunda jornada virtual. Estaremos compartiendo las promociones a través de emails, a través de nuestro blog y en nuestras redes sociales. Tenemos un grupo en Facebook, se llama Comunidad de Práctica para el Desarrollo de Competencias de Información, Investigación. También nos pueden conseguir por Twitter y LinkedIn. Y cualquier duda me pueden escribir a mi email ivette.maldonado1@upr.edu. Muchas gracias y que disfruten.
Agradecemos a la doctora Maldonado por su saludo y por el trabajo y el compromiso que tiene con la comunidad de práctica. En estos momentos lo voy a dejar con el saludo del doctor José Sánchez.
Hello and welcome to all participants in this seminar, this webinar. It is a pleasure for me to greet you in this day, and on behalf of the community of practice, to all communities of practice, but in particular this community of practice, I would like to share my deepest sympathy for all those who are in some way cannot have the other possibilities of connecting with us, and at the same time share my joy that this activity, the fourth year, and the fourth national meeting for information competencies that is held here in Puerto Rico. And it's been a long way since we began the project of communities of practice, and I know that the different colleagues that have been part of this community, that have shared their knowledge, their experience, and their wisdom with all of us in this community. I am sure that we will all be today reminded of how important it is to go beyond what we have already been doing, since we will be listening and participating in this wonderful activity in which both professors, Trudy Jacobson as well as Thomas Maki, will share with us the different their theories, their experiences, and their practices. We welcome you, and we know that this will be a very, very rewarding experience. Thank you very much, and have a great experience.
Muchas gracias al doctor Sánchez. El Encuentro Nacional de Competencias de Información, que está en su cuarta edición, es una actividad bienal donde pretendemos acercar a los profesionales de la información de diversos niveles académicos y escolar para dialogar e intercambiar información relevante a las competencias de información. Esta primera conferencia de la segunda jornada lleva por título Metaliteracy, Engaging Students Through Assessment as Learning. Antes de iniciar con las presentaciones, deseo mencionarles algunas instrucciones generales. A los participantes pueden escribir sus preguntas, compartir las preguntas a través del chat. Estaremos pendientes a sus preguntas. Al final de las presentaciones habrá tiempo para poder hacer un intercambio, ¿no?, de esas preguntas y las respuestas. Se proveerá un certificado de participación a esta actividad a quienes completen la evaluación, que se proveerá más adelante, así que pendientes al enlace del formulario electrónico que podrán completar y que estará disponible hasta 2 horas después de la actividad. Y le invitamos a suscribirse al canal de YouTube de la comunidad de práctica de competencias de información e investigación. Ahora voy a iniciar con la presentación de nuestra primera ponente. Our first speaker, Trudy Jacobson, is a distinguished librarian, is the head of the Information Literacy Department at the University of Albany. She co-chaired the Association of College and Research Libraries Task Force that created the framework for information literacy for higher education. With Dr. Thomas Maki, she co-developed Metaliteracy. Her most recent work focused on open pedagogy and how the students' learning experience can be enhanced in such settings by metaliteracy. She is the co-author or co-editor of 14 books and numerous scholarly articles and book chapters. She is the editor of the Innovations in Information Literacy book series published by Rowman and Littlefield. Ahora el doctor José Sánchez les presentará al segundo ponente.
Yes, the second speaker will be Dr. Thomas Maki. He's a professor of arts and media in the School of Arts and Humanities at the State University of New York, Empire State College. His research about metaliteracy, a pedagogical framework he originated with Professor Trudy Jacobson, has led to 3 published books, including their most recent entitled Metaliterate, Learning for the Post-Truth World. Dr. Maki teaches courses in digital storytelling, history and theory of new media, information design, and ethics of digital art and design, and he has developed several international massive open online courses about metaliteracy. His faculty website is https://www.tpmaki.com. I leave you now with these excellent speakers.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for those the lovely introductions. We are absolutely delighted to be here and to share in this event and the conversation that will be happening this morning.
And I share Trudy's enthusiasm for being here as well. And thank you for such a warm welcome. We really appreciate it and really looking forward to today. So I will share slides now and Trudy will start. So I'll share now. Let me know if you can see this okay, and then we'll begin the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tom. So as was mentioned, our talk is Metaliteracy, Engaging Students Through Assessment as Learning. And we'll be going through all of these ideas today. So what our plan for the couple of hours that we have with you is on the next slide. And we will be exploring. Tom, will it change? Okay. Tom, okay. So while we're waiting for the slides to come back, let me just go over what it is we're going to be talking about. We're going to be starting off with engaging students in learning. And developing a metaliteracy mindset. From there, we will talk about metaliteracy and open learning. We'll then talk about metaliteracy and assessment, and then integrating this assessment through metaliteracy in your own setting. So we'll be talking about some that we've done, but we will also be asking for your ideas as well. So it looks like our slides are coming back. Great. And if we can go on to the first quote.
Okay, is this working okay? Great.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Something happened in that initial transition. Here we go.
So here's just written out what I was talking about. And on the next slide, okay, wonderful. So thinking about learners and learning, and this quote by Eric Hoffer, in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Which just emphasizes the ever-present change that we find ourselves in. And you can't really declare yourself done with learning, because however much an authority you might be at one point, unless the situation freezes at that point, you're soon going to be out of date. And we have one more quote on the topic of learners and learning. And this one is by Abigail Adams. And she said, learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended to with diligence. So there's effort involved, but there's also the mindset that you want to do this. And this calls upon more than just the cognitive, the thinking part, and the behavioral aspects of learning. We're going to be coming back to those learning domains a little bit later on. So we'll start off with engaging students in learning. And we have set up a Padlet, which on the next slide you will see the URL for. And what we'd like to do there is to have you sort of jot down things that grab your attention from the presentation, what really resonates with you, and what can you add from your own experience. And there is also a column to ask questions if you'd like. We also have a QR code for this, if it's easier for you to get there, if you just want to sort of grab that with your phone. And we will be checking in on the Padlet, and we'll also be offering some other opportunities for you to take a few minutes to put things on the Padlet and to read what others are saying. So let me start off with just a little bit of a teaser. On the next slide, what hopefully will show up. This is significant learner contributions to Wikipedia. And you probably are wondering why I'm showing a snippet from a Wikipedia article on phonological rule. I can't even pronounce it. So on the next slide, you'll get a little bit of more of a hint, and then we'll come back to this later. What you're seeing now is the dashboard for a course that I teach. And it lists the articles students are working on. The pink arrow indicates how many words were added. And then over on the right-hand side, how many views. So this phonological rule, which was worked on by one of my students, he added 1,937 words, and it has since gotten over 6,000 views. So this is learner engagement. This was something he came into the course having no idea he was going to be doing. But we will talk about it later. But I just wanted to show this as an indication that learners can get very involved. Okay, and I am going to pass this over to Tom.
Thanks, Trudy. And I'm going to transition here, put my camera on, and go back to the presentation. So hopefully you can see these slides okay. And what we're going to talk about is our approach, which we see as really developing a metaliteracy mindset. And as you'll see today during our presentation, metacognition is really a central part of our model. So let's take a look at how we originally envisioned the metaliteracy framework, because several of these key ideas are still relevant to the model. And then we're going to talk about how the ideas for this have really developed. But going back to really our first article introducing this concept, these are some of the key ideas, that metaliteracy is really intended to challenge just a skills-based approach to information literacy. And especially at the time, information literacy was very much grounded in this idea of skills development. And clearly skills are important, but what we try to do and what we're trying to do in this work is go beyond skills and more of a scaffolding what comes after. Metaliteracy also reinforces what we call a critical thinking filter. And so this idea of critical thinking, which was always been key to information literacy, is also a very important part of metaliteracy. And especially today when in social media environments where traditional editorial filters often don't even exist, what we're saying is that the learner really needs to have their own filter. Another key aspect is this idea that metaliteracy really advances effective participation in social media environments, online communities, virtual environments, all these kinds of emerging technologies and spaces, and trying to foreground that. But at the same time, we really see this as a learning theory that really can take place in any environment, including face-to-face environments, and we'll show some examples of that. And also metaliteracy supports this idea of acquiring, producing, and sharing knowledge in collaborative online communities, and really any kind of community. But this idea of learner as producer is really central to the model, and we'll be talking about that as well. So building on those ideas, we now have really these 4 core components of metaliteracy, and that's what we'll be talking about. So we have learner domains, we have the roles of the metaliterate learner, we have the characteristics, those attributes that a learner gains through the model, and then of course the goals and learning objectives. So we'll be talking through these really 4 key components of the model. And this is really the current figure, the current diagram that brings all of this together. And this is something we've just developed, and it will be a model that we will talk through in quite a lot of detail in our new book that'll be coming out this year about the learner as producer. And we'll be talking through each of these pieces, but think of this as kind of a wheel where all of these different circles really can be dialed and adjusted. So the alignment that you see here is really not the only way this can happen. All of these key concepts can move. So we really see this as a dynamic model where the learner is at the center. We really look at the 4 domains of learning: metacognition, cognition, behavioral, and affective domains. We have then, that's surrounded by these characteristics, which we'll talk through. And then, of course, at the outer ring, what we really see is central to this is the roles that metaliterate learners play, and to really foreground those roles in the learning process. And we'll be showing how we do that with several examples. But that's the overall model now as we see it, where we really have brought all these elements together. So Trudy now is going to talk about the learning domains.
Okay, so this is starting at the center of the diagram that Tom just talked through with you. Now, if you think back to the Abigail Adams quote, "Learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended to with diligence." So keeping that in mind as we think about the 4 learning domains, Tom mentioned that metacognition is extremely important for metaliteracy. So, and that's what learners are thinking about their own thinking, they're monitoring their own learning, their preconceptions, what it is that they still need to learn. So in the quote where she talks about attended to with diligence, I think the metacognitive aspect is particularly important. The affective, where it's change in learners' emotions or attitudes through engagement with the learning activities, or perhaps the emotions and attitudes they go into those activities with. The other part of her quote on learning was, "It must be sought for with ardor." And that is calling upon the affective domain. The cognitive and the behavioral, when we think back to information literacy and skills-based, those are the ones that were always highlighted. So the cognitive is what a student or a learner should know when they've finished learning activities, and the behavioral is what they should be able to do at that point. But adding in these additional 2 domains really shifts things quite importantly. And I will also talk about the learner roles before turning this back over to Tom. And you can see here the roles that you saw before, and some of them are being highlighted. So Eric Hoffer's quote talks about learning for life, and you'll be taking on a variety of roles. All of us will. We're all learners. But as we take them on, the more that we recognize what it is that we're doing, the more intently you can consider what that role means and how successfully you're doing it. Okay? So self-awareness is really very critical here. I'll talk about just a couple of these that are have some text, some questions with them, and then just a couple of the others. So producer. Tom mentioned the importance of learner as producer, metaliterate learner as producer. These are questions that we have written along with a colleague, Kelsey O'Brien, to highlight sort of the responsibilities one has with these roles that really make them more tangible. So with producer, do you produce and share your own user-generated content? Very often, the students we work with don't think of these things as actual information production. So the questions give them a new way to consider the roles. For communicator, do you see your role as somebody who communicates consciously and conscientiously in a variety of forums? Again, something that, unless one is really cognizant of the role one is assuming, one may not pay as much attention. On the metaliteracy.org website, we have questions for all of them. Teacher, I think it's always been my favorite. I wonder why, but learners can be teachers, and sort of thinking about that and realizing they don't have to be an expert, in the way that their professor might be, if you're talking about somebody who's in school, but they have things that they know well that they can teach to others. And translator could be from one language to another, but it could also be for people who maybe are not as well versed in an area. So for example, I teach a lot of philosophy students, and they could translate some of these philosophical theories for me because I don't have that expertise. So I will now turn this back over to Tom, who will be talking about characteristics.
Thanks so much, Trudy. And it's important, too, to think about how these roles are interrelated. And as part of this, too, we developed the characteristics of the metaliterate learner. So thinking about the roles, really trying to foreground those roles so that students see the roles that they play, analyze them, and then really try to identify areas where they can grow in those roles. And at the outcome of that then are these characteristics that learners gain through this process. So you'll see an alignment here in some of the language and some of the roles. So the first one, I'm going to go around this diagram in a kind of clockwise manner. So starting with the productive roles, obviously connected to being a producer, so learner as producer. And of course, we want learners to really see themselves in these roles. We want to engage them in work where they can be creative and informed at the same time. And also to reflect on that work. So it's not just a how to do something, it's really a reflective process of what they're creating, no matter what the media format is. And it could be something, from an essay, from a written essay, to multimedia production or to a digital story. Also, the next one I'll talk about is collaborative, which is really key. And so from the very beginning of the model, we really wanted to emphasize that learners are not in isolation, that we learn through social learning, which has been a theory for many years. This idea that we don't learn just by ourselves, we learn when we're engaging with others. So that we really also then want to highlight being collaborative, support this in the kinds of work that we engage our students with, so that we're really reinforcing this dialogue among students. We want them to see this kind of shared role. And this is really where the teaching piece comes in too, that Trudy had mentioned. So the teaching role, again, students may not see this, but if they're working on collaborative projects, if they're supporting each other in working with the technology or working through ideas or a concept, they really then play that role of teacher because they're sharing knowledge. And we see this as something that's central to really being a co-creator of knowledge. And again, not working just in isolation. The reflective part, because metacognition is central to this idea, we really want students to be aware of this reflective process so that going through learning activities, then students become more reflective. And then we hope that that is something that they continue throughout their lifespan. And then civic-minded is important too, because if learners are thinking of themselves within these social environments, again, whether it's in a classroom or a makerspace or an online community, it's important for the students to think about their ethical responsibilities in these environments and to also think about the contributions that they make to a community. So thinking about civic responsibility and accountability within these contexts. So you can think of all the issues we're grappling with now with social media and accountability in those environments, and the kinds of contributions people make to those environments is critically important. Now, connectivity is not enough. The fact that learners are connected in these networks, it's great that that happens, but it's not enough. So what we try to do is foreground the ethical dimension of this process. So that's kind of an overview of the model. So how do we engage learners with these goals and with the related goals and learning objectives, which are really the fourth key component? So I'm going to talk through this and show the four main goals, and then we've highlighted a few or an objective for each one, and this provides kind of an overview of how we see this and how the goals are interrelated. So from, again, going around this clockwise, from goal 1, which is actively evaluate content while also evaluating one's own biases, to goal 2, which is focused on intellectual property, goal 3, which is about producing and sharing information, and then goal 4, which is really thinking about this as a developing strategies for lifelong learning to meet an individual's professional and personal goals. So I'll just kind of talk through these a little bit more detail, and I also want to note that we really the Spanish translations you're seeing are done by Dora Sales, so we want to thank her very much. And if you go to metaliteracy.org, you can actually see that the metaliteracy goals and learning objectives have been now translated in several languages. So we're very fortunate, our friends around the world who have generously offered to actually translate the goals and learning objectives. So we very much appreciate that. So goal 1, this idea of actively evaluating content while also evaluating one's own biases. So that idea of content evaluation has always been a central part of information literacy. It was a part of metaliteracy from the beginning too, this idea of creating a critical thinking filter. But we really wanted to also have a focus on bias, and so that learners are evaluating their bias and also evaluating bias of the information sources that they encounter and also the content itself. So that's the overarching goal. The objective we selected here brings in both the affective and metacognitive dimension. So within that goal, then, an objective is to reflect on how you feel about information or an information environment to consider multiple perspectives. So this really shows how those themes that we originally talked about are really put into action here through goals and objectives. And I also think it's important to note that very much, I think many times in an effort to ask students to be objective, we diminish the affective piece of this, but it's also important to really foreground that, so to foreground their feelings and to have them analyze it through metacognitive reflection, because that too will allow them to gain some new insights. So goal 2 focused on, again, if you're thinking about the importance of learner as producer, we really want students as an overarching goal to engage with all intellectual property in an ethical and responsible manner. So again, that idea of being a civic-minded digital citizen is really key here. So that's the overall goal. One of the objectives is a behavioral and cognitive objective, so that learners differentiate between copyright, Creative Commons, and open licensing. And I teach a course in digital storytelling. This idea of having students to think about sort of the production of original content and not to just take images or sound files from the web, that they need a much deeper understanding of these kinds of issues. Goal 3, as you can see, this idea of learner as producer and is really important to the model. So as an overarching goal, that learners will produce and share information in collaborative and participatory environments. So you can see how we're putting that language into action here based on the model itself. And this one is an effective and metacognitive objective, and it really gets to something that Trudy said, that students don't always see themselves in these roles. So they may really be very active with the latest digital device, and might be sharing all kinds of content, but may not see their role as a producer that goes beyond just consuming information and consuming these kinds of digital devices, because it goes much deeper than that. And then the 4th main goal, to develop learning strategies to meet lifelong personal and professional goals. So this idea that metaliteracy really is a lifelong learning process, and the objective that we selected to reinforce this is both behavioral and metacognitive, and you can see that in the language, that it's to engage in informed, self-directed learning that encourages a broader worldview through a global reach of today's social media environment. So really trying to highlight there the potential of these social information environments beyond the kinds of misinformation, disinformation that they're going to identify in these environments, but looking at the potential for this, and also to really support self-directed learning in these environments. And that can happen, being self-directed, as the literature shows, is not just being in isolation, but it really is working through a collaborative process, social process. So how do we engage learners? And this next section, Trudy and I will be both exploring this. It really focuses on the roles that inform metaliteracy in practice, and this idea of providing opportunities for learners to grow in a variety of learner-student engagement. So this idea of having a growth mindset as they work through this process. So in this next section, you're going to see, again, some of the language of metaliteracy, and specifically many of the roles in action. So let's take a look at this this first one, and again, this I think visualizes this, I think, effectively. This idea that metaliterate learners are producers, and I really appreciate this quote from Renee Hobbs, who's very focused in her work on media literacy. And the quote, I think, says it all, that if everyone tries hard to create and share what is true, what is beautiful, and what has value to others, and if we all avoided created content that harms people, the world really would be a better place. And I think that quote really says it all, especially in today's information environment, the kinds of images that we see online. It's also important to think about, even though connectivity is not enough, but that we are in this networked environment. We are in a connected environment. So how do we leverage that environment in ways that are meaningful and purposeful? And I think in many ways, Tim Berners-Lee's original vision for the web as this connected environment that really does change things, and changes things for good, is something that we all need to aspire to. And I think it's an idea that we really want to engage our learners in as well. Also, this idea that metaliterate learners are metacognitive, and the idea that reflection is a central part of this process, because students gain new insights, and because of the self-regulated aspect of it that Flavel first talked about in his really groundbreaking article on this, is that learners then take control of their own learning. They see the learning process itself, they reflect on what they know, they reflect on the skill set that they currently have, the knowledge that they currently have, but they take charge of that learning. They are a partner in this process, in really what is a social process, and that they identify areas for continued growth themselves through this reflective metacognitive piece. And then, of course, this idea that because metaliteracy is so related to critical thinking, that learners are researchers. Metaliterate learners are researchers. And this quote from Stephen Brookfield is an excellent way of putting it, so that he talks about critical thinking supporting learners to take informed actions that are grounded in evidence that can be explained to others and stand a good chance of achieving the results we desire. And I think that that's something that we're always trying to do in our learning, so that students have access to all of these resources and they can be producers of information, but we really want them to be informed producers. We want them to take the kind of informed actions that Brookfield talks about that is so central to being an informed researcher. And of course, this is one of the roles that Trudy mentioned, and this idea that metaliterate learners are teachers. And I think Paulo Freire, of course, emphasized this in a way that I think that is so inspiring, that without dialogue, there is no communication. And without communication, there can be no true education. So this idea that working in dialogue with learners, it has that social dimension. And clearly, the students themselves, there's certainly a dialogue between student and teacher that's so important. But as this image shows, there's a dialogue happening among students themselves, and we really want to foreground their roles as teachers. All right, so we are actually going to, we're going to take a 5-minute coffee break. And this could also be a stretch break, so if you just want to, get up and stretch, that would be fine too. Trudy and I will actually stay here because we presented so much information to start. What we'd like to do is make some time available for questions. So we're here. We'd like to take any questions you have in this first part of the keynote. But if you want to go get a coffee, go get a coffee. If you want to stand up, walk around the room, that's okay too. And we're here and we're available to take any questions.
And you might also want to add to the Padlet. I see some things are coming through, and Tom will, if you want to move to the next slide, we can get
Perfect.
back the URL and the QR code.
Trudy, I wonder if we want other ideas to get things started that we want to, from the Padlet, do we have something that we could start with, or?
Yes, there's actually one that I think, Tom, I will send your way. I think it's a great question. Would you add social as a learning domain?
That's an excellent question. I think that this is important too, because we often get questions about, what about this role, or what about this dimension? The way, as a domain, I think that those 4 learning domains, what we're trying to do there is think about the learner. So the metaliterate learner is always at the center, and that's why in all of these diagrams, the metaliterate learner is at the center. So we think of those domains as those 4 key domains of metacognition and being affective, behavioral, and cognitive. And I think within that there is a social dimension as well. And I think that because this idea of being a social learner is embedded throughout the metaliteracy framework, that's where I would place it. I would say that the 4 learning domains are really more about the individual themselves and sort of what they bring to a social environment. What do you think about that, Trudy? It's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question, and I was sort of thinking about it as I saw it and was asking it, and I think, Tom, that your response was right on. But I love the question. I think it asks us to think about things in a way that just shifts the focus a little bit.
And it also shows the importance of the social dimension, and I think that that's something that does resonate with people. I think we're all aware now that, you know, social learning is so key to the learning process itself, and that's something that's been theorized, you know, for decades. But I think in some ways these kinds of social environments we're in, that's something that we need to better, I think, leverage and make students aware of. You know, social media, for example, it's great that everyone can connect, but there's much more to that than the connectivity.
There's a question about assessment, and this one I'm just going to say, we will get to this in the second half, but is assessment as learning the same as formative learning? And if not, how are they different? So that will be coming soon. And then there's one, are you using producer interchangeably with creator?
That's a good one. I think I do tend to, this is my thoughts on that. I think I do tend to use those words interchangeably. It's interesting with producer, there's something about that word that I think even has a different kind of, to me, that word is very associated with digital and media production. You know, the idea of producing a video or producing a multimedia presentation. Although I think creator is too, because I think creator, in some ways, I think, and again, I'm just thinking out loud here, is very focused on sort of an artistic dimension. Although producer can be too. I'd love to hear someone else's views on that. I mean, Trudy, how do you tend to use those?
Yeah, I do, I think, use producer as creator, but perhaps in a slightly broader sense. One of the things that I have found with the term creator is that people sometimes then morph over into creative, and they say, I'm not creative. Can't do that.
Right.
And so I think that producer doesn't have some of those connotations that creator might, but I think I do tend to use them very closely aligned.
You know, that's a good point you made too, is that, and this is something I've found, and we'll talk about this when I show some examples later, there is that reluctance sometimes for students, they don't think they can do this, right? That point that, oh, I'm not creative, or I'm not a producer. But when they're given the opportunity to do that, and it might be challenging the first time, there's something about creating or producing whatever it is, whether it's a work of art or a theater production or a digital story or an image. There's something very empowering about that, and that's why I think that these roles are so important, because sometimes students may not see themselves as being creative or productive, but when given the opportunity, it seems to really reinforce that. And that's something I've noticed in my teaching, I mean, for years. And that's why I was originally very interested in, when, you know, the web emerged, of really having students be a part of that space and to really learn how the web works and how digital images can be created, and you know, bringing that all together.
So Tom, I think we have an idea I'd like to share that I think maybe we should hold for the longer period we're going to have at the end.
Okay.
And we really appreciate your adding to the Padlet, and I know that there may be things also in the queue of the chat for YouTube. So we are going to leave a good amount of time at the end to go through this and to hear your ideas. So thank you. Please continue to share.
Great questions so far. Thank you.
So I hope everybody enjoyed their coffee or tea or stretch or whatever. And we're going to go back into the presentation. And so going back to this, how do we engage learners? And the importance of assessment and open learning. So we often think of assessment as either summative sort of at the end of the learning to see what someone has learned, or formative as an opportunity to provide feedback while learning is still taking place, sort of having a chance to shape continued learning. But can formative assessment be broken down more granularly? So we're getting to that question that we got. And how can we use assessment to engage learners? What can open learning add to the mix? And of course, we want to bring metaliteracy into the equation. So now that you have a good overview of metaliteracy, we're going to start to bring all these themes together. At first, introducing the assessment and the open learning, but then providing examples that do bring all three together. And at the end, some metaliteracy resources that will help you to do this. So please continue to add your ideas to the Padlet, because we're only going to be touching sort of the tip of the iceberg, and hearing about more ideas, ways you might be doing some of these things would be just fabulous. But moving on, what we'd like to do is, we've been talking quite a bit. And what we'd like is now to hear from you some more. Are you familiar with the term assessment as learning? Or if you aren't, what does it suggest to you? So if you could, either through the URL there or the shortened one with the code, and you don't need to put the spaces in, or we also have a QR code. If you could go to this and add your ideas about what assessment as learning sort of means to you. And we will give you a couple of minutes to do that.
And the QR code really works. If you have your cell phone and you just move your phone up to the QR code, it really does work.
And Tom, will you then be able to show this?
Yes.
Great.
Are we ready?
Excellent. Why don't we give it another 30 seconds or so?
Sounds good. So there's really three ways to get to the survey. The URL, the main mentee.com site with the code, or the QR code. I love that the QR code works.
All right, why don't we try it now and see what's there?
So this will go to an external website. So let's see if this, let me know if this shows up on the screen okay. And can you see that okay?
Yes. Okay, so assess the product, assess the process, personal, interactive. I love the colors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I'm just refreshing it.
Oh, okay, great.
I don't have to refresh. It looks like it keeps adding to it.
They're doing
People respond.
Opportunity, yeah, definitely. Awareness, I think I've got a bar in front of part of this one. Looks like awareness, interactive. These are great terms.
Yeah. Relearning. I like that one.
Yep.
Relearning.
Yep.
Measure.
That's fabulous.
Excellent responses.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. So, Tom, I'll give you a second if you are able to
Go back.
go back. Yeah.
So make sure you let me know if can you see that okay?
Right now we're seeing the mentee page.
Huh. All right. Let's see here. I wonder if I need to close that.
Okay.
Does it work?
Now we're back. Whoop. When you went back over to the left, back into the slides, that worked.
So we're back.
Now we're still in the Menti.
Oh.
Now we're in the slide. Perfect. Okay. So thank you for sharing your responses. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about assessment as learning on the next slide. So assessment for learning is formative assessment. And so that showed up in the question that we got on the Padlet. Assessment as learning is a subset of assessment for learning. And on the next slide, you can see that it emphasizes using assessment as a process of developing and supporting metacognition for students. So learners can reflect on what they know, what they still need to know at any point. And they're not reliant on others for assessing them. The external assessment, that formative external assessment can certainly be helpful, and it can help them sort of model it, but they're learning through and from their own assessment. So being able to add elements into the learning experience where they sort of get this opportunity really provides a lot of potential. And some of those terms that were on the Menti were just ideal. So that's the assessment as learning. And we'll move on to open pedagogy. So a framework for revising the practice of teaching to engage students in actively shaping their learning and contributing to public knowledge. Now, I have to say that I've cheated a little bit here. This is actually a definition of open education practices from EDUCAUSE, but it works perfectly for open pedagogy. And indeed, there is an enormous amount of overlap between open pedagogy and open educational practices. Open educational practices are broader. They might include things like open scholarship and OER. There's a variety of things, whereas the open pedagogy is focused on sort of really that learning process. I had a really interesting conversation with Catherine Cronin, who's working in Ireland, and she's doing an awful lot with open educational practices. But what she said when I asked her about the difference in terms is that in Europe, she sees more use of open educational practices, and in the US, more open pedagogy, even though this EDUCAUSE document is using open educational practices. So it can be confusing, but I just love this definition, is the bottom line. And I think it works really well for the open pedagogy. So we have a quote on that I think is very vivid on this screen here. And this is just the beginning of it. And if I may, I'm going to read the whole thing to you. Just couldn't get the whole thing onto the slide. Open pedagogy is not for the faint of heart, not faint-hearted teachers or faint-hearted students. To some degree, it is like sewing your parachute after you have jumped from the plane. As a professor, you have to put your fate in your students' hands. In order to empower them, you have to trust them and make yourself vulnerable. Open pedagogy only works if you are all falling through space and all sewing the parachute together. But what an amazing feeling when the parachute snaps open and you see the world like you never have before. For those of you who've engaged in open pedagogy and when it's worked, I certainly know that this seeing the world like you never have before is right on target. I think, too, that when it talks about you're sort of all sewing the parachute together, That goes back to that communication and that quote from Freire that Tom mentioned. So I just wanted to move open pedagogy away from the theory and into the emotion of it. So on this next slide, it's the first of two that will talk about some elements connected to open pedagogy. And I think that this is really fascinating. This is developed by Reynolds, Gibbs, and Zepke, the citations on the next slide. But they did this collaboratively via social media. And I think they came up with a great set of characteristics, and I just love that creation process. So I'm going to talk about these 8 over the 2 slides, but I'm also going to walk you through them using the Wikipedia example that I started off with learner engagement. So let me give you just a little bit of background. I teach a 7-week information literacy course that has mostly seniors in it from all different majors, but philosophy students and East Asian studies and Korean studies students are required to take it. It is a mixture of information literacy with the ACRL framework, some of the frames, metaliterary, and then actually in this open pedagogy part of it, they are creating content on Wikipedia. None of them have ever done this before. I have not found a single student who has done it. And they are doing this within about a 3 to 4 week period. So just as with that background, let me talk about these. So in open pedagogy, there's agency. This learner agency allows learners to operate really independently and explore freely. And there are all different levels of open pedagogy. So as you think about this, this could be something where they can operate independently in a part of the course or for an assignment. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. But this agency allows a very different approach to learning and to teaching. And in the Wikipedia class, students can decide how they're going to alter the article that they have decided to work on. And then they have selected this article through the next characteristic of choice. So it was their choice. They can sort of choose the pace, the direction, the connections, again, depending on what it is you're doing in a class. The expansion. So they're moving into learning networks that you're not necessarily controlling the way you would do so in a typical class. And they have a chance to expand connections. With the students who are working on Wikipedia articles, they have the entire Wikipedia community as their learning network. And they also work with students in another course to get peer reviews. So these are things that would not normally have happened. And then creativity. So this may not necessarily be creativity in the accepted sense, although it could be, but it's, as it says here, stimuli for new perspectives and ideas, both on the part of the students and on your own part. So seeing things and thinking about things really differently based on the input of so many people. Just as on the Padlet had the idea of, should social be a domain? Bringing in these ideas are so important. So on the next slide, the next sort of characteristic is student constructed. And students aren't just using the resources that you're sharing with them. They need to come up with their own supports and resources, their own networks. So this goes back in a way to that expansion idea. Open-ended problems. It's a focus on solutions and the process, not over an actual product or a right answer. the way that you might have in a more traditional course. And then the open-endedness and the solutions in the Wikipedia assignments, it's providing additional information for people all over the world to access. So it's a solution to a real problem. Yeah, the unmeasurable outcomes. Yeah, I sort of conflated these, but there's not one thing that you're looking for, because the students are going to be working on things a little bit differently, but you can assess their learning if you know where they were when they started out. This is also a place where assessment as learning plays a role. So learners can assess what it is they have learned and what they have been able to do through reflection. And then the last one, risk and goodness. So they aren't doing the expected. And students in classes with open pedagogy can find it a little bit nerve-wracking. But what I'm finding is providing scaffolding through metaliteracy really helps. So thinking about these learning domains, the affective domain is really important here. And the scaffolding, because they don't know what's going to happen. There's this risk involved. So on Wikipedia, your work can be removed in the blink of an eye. And how do you cope with that? Okay. So before I go into metaliteracy, Tom, is there anything you wanted to say about any of these?
No, I think it's an excellent way to outline it, and it's so interesting as you're talking through it. I'm relating it to my own classes in digital storytelling, where I think that this is playing out as well. And I'll talk about that when I mention the specific cases that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But this is I think an excellent overview of these connections and sort of a process for this.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I was tired of hearing myself speak. So,
No, anytime, Trudy, anytime. Yeah, I could relate to every single one of these points in terms of what's happening in the digital storytelling class. So it was an excellent discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, going on to designing open learning with metaliteracy. Okay, and so we've got 5 items here. So determine which open metaliteracy content meets your needs or provides inspiration. So we've talked about some key points, key elements of metaliteracy. And for those, will the learning domains provide the key? Is it the roles that you're interested in? Is it a mix of those? So thinking about what fits your learning situation the best. And we're also going to be talking later about some actual metaliteracy sort of products that you can use as well. Okay. For the second one, adapt the goals and learning objectives to align with your own learning objectives for the course. Tom talked about the 4 goals earlier. Each one of those has a number of learning objectives, and you can easily pick the ones that support and enhance what your own learning objectives are. For the third one, encourage learners to envision themselves in the active metaliterate learner roles. And I talked earlier about the understanding that this is a role. Tom mentioned the connections between roles, and there's the self-awareness of doing this conscientiously. So the fourth one, encourage learners to identify strengths and areas for continued growth. Does this sound like assessment as learning? Okay. And then using open pedagogy aligns extremely well here, providing the conditions for this to happen. And the fifth one, develop learning activities that encourage metacognitive reflection. Again, assessment as learning. And so what we're going to do next is we are going to look at how these can be put into practice, and I'm turning it back over to Tom.
Thanks so much, Trudy. And this one really relates to a lot of the open content that we've developed. So from the very beginning of our working together on this, we've really expanded our work to the Metaliteracy Learning Collaborative. And so we've really embraced this idea of openness. So we've created badging content, we've created MOOCs, interactive learning objects, videos, and we've done it together with our colleague Kelsey O'Brien. So here's an example. So all of that work is available via metaliterary.org. And here's one example. So determine which open metaliteracy content meets your needs. We've done this ourselves. So this is an example of something that I've done in my digital storytelling class, where we've used this video that we produced called Telling Your Digital Story. And what's interesting about this is that I've been teaching this course, Digital Storytelling, for years at Empire State College. I actually wrote about it, doing analysis in the first metaliteracy book that we did, and I'm still working in the course, and I'm going to show you a few examples of that later. But what's interesting, that work inspired a video that we wrote the script together, and then our colleague Kelsey O'Brien produced it in a wonderful way, very visually interesting, dynamic way, where it talks about telling your digital story. So it goes through this process of the steps you need to take in terms of producing a digital story. But this video also goes through all the learner roles. So it's really creating a strong connection link to metaliteracy itself. So it goes beyond just a how-to. So in this example, I've taken that video, which we now have in our first MOOC, and I've actually brought it to the course. So I teach this course fully online, and this is the course that inspired the video to begin with, and now it's in the digital storytelling course itself, so that through this one example of again, adapting that multimedia content into the course so that students learn about the process of digital storytelling, learn what it is, how to create a digital story, but it also encourages them to reflect on their learning while doing so. And it also supports their self-assessment of learning. So again, that's just one example of taking something that's open that we've produced, building it into a course. And then the second one, adapt metaliteracy goals and learning objectives to align with your own. So in this first one, see oneself as a producer of information. And again, going beyond that consumer role. And the language there, that could be used as is, as something that supports that third goal, this first objective of that third goal. But you can change the language as well. You can adapt it any way you want for whatever kind of work you're doing, because that idea of seeing oneself as a producer as well as a consumer could happen for these digital stories, videos, graphic design, art, theater, digital media, maker spaces. It could really be anything. So that's how you could just, again, adapt that language to a particular setting that's unique to your work. And Trudy, I think this is yours.
Thank you. So in this case, there we go. Okay, so encourage learners to identify strengths and areas for continued growth. In a political science class, the professor asked the students to identify one role that they would like to work on during the semester, take ownership of it, and then throughout the course, she asked the students to report in writing or in class on their progress and how it was impacting their learning. So you can see that metacognition is going to be really very important there. But this is something, although it's a political science class, it would work fine in any class.
Excuse me, Dr. Maki and Dr. Jacobson. I just want to remind you that you have 5 minutes left.
Five minutes?
Yes. Sorry about that.
Okay. Tom, how would you like to do this then?
So let's see. Yeah, I thought we were going to the half hour and then have a half hour of questions, but we can.
That was our understanding.
So let's see here. We can maybe we'll move through these.
Do you think we should skip down to slide 47, the section on the learner activities?
Sure.
Because we wanted to just or
See, I actually don't see the numbers.
Oh, okay. Why don't we go back to the first of the blue slides? How do we engage? Okay, or this is fine.
Yeah, we can go to the examples.
Okay. So just very quickly,
you can extend it like 10 more minutes. If you can fit your presentation, just go ahead with it, please. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Okay. So what we wanted to show here were just some things that we and other people have been doing. In this case, I taught a first-year experience course, and the students in that class, if you can see, it's sort of small, but they created a frequently asked questions, some zines, podcasts, infographics, all for other first-year students. And so these students didn't have the knowledge to work on Wikipedia articles the way the seniors I teach do, but they were able to really put into some format, all these different formats, sort of the emotions they were going through as a first-year student, particularly during the pandemic. And all of our materials are going to be available, and we encourage you to take a look through any of the ones that are available in this section.
And this is the course I've been talking about throughout the presentation, where the learner as producer, it really plays out. So in this context, students are creating digital stories. They produce selfie videos where they introduce themselves to the class. And they actually, we just revised the class. I'm teaching this with Dr. Aird, one of my colleagues at Empire State College. And the selfie videos, they introduce themselves to the class, but they go beyond that. They talk about which of these roles that resonate with them the most. They also produce videos about mobile digital storytelling, so this idea of being on the move, and then also where they, we want them to take on this role of empowerment and really engage with that idea. This one, I'm just going to show a quick snippet of this. This is one where students could really create whatever they wanted, and I'll just show it just very, very briefly so you can see how dynamic and interesting this is.
You and me, crouching behind a bullet-ridden cinder block wall, haggling over a percent of something silent contains, watching the musicians' hands and smiling knowingly, taking our clothes off to pray, handing each other ratchets.
And what's really interesting here is all original video, original poetry, original music. Again, this idea that learners are producers and making them aware of sort of what they can create. This is an example of work that is being done in the virtual world of Second Life. And Valerie Hill wrote a guest blog post for metaliterary.org that you can read. And and there's more going on here than connections. It really is immersing oneself in a virtual world. And she's been doing these, she calls it symbolic modeling of metaliteracy, where learners, participants join her in Second Life and create these three-dimensional renderings of metaliteracy based on how they feel about it. So I just find that so fascinating because it's combining learner's producer role with that affective response. So how you feel about metaliteracy and really engaging with that as an idea. And then here, someone else who posted a guest writing for metaliterary.org, Sarah Nagel, who is doing fascinating work with makerspace communities. Again, showing that metaliteracy is not just for these online environments, that it can really be these place-based environments as well, because we really think of it as a learning theory. And she really talks about the kind of metacognitive reflection that goes on in these makerspace communities. So not only are learners producing objects in this kind of real world, but they're developing what she calls a maker mindset for the critical evaluation of one's own beliefs and outlooks. So again, just a fascinating exploration of these ideas in the kind of real world. And Trudy, you're going to talk about researching through digital badging.
Right. So this is the political science class that I mentioned earlier. This is a quote from an article, a chapter that I wrote with the professor of that class. So this is that idea of, if you can reflect on your own perspective, then you can sort out those of others and take the initiative to expand the range of sources you consult. So in this case, the students are working with some content that we have, and you'll see a little bit more of later, that was originally designed for a digital badging system. It's based on the goals and learning objectives of metaliteracy, but there are short activities that sort of build up to accumulating activities. And so this is something that the students do some research and create their own content.
And here's another example, going back to the digital storytelling course and all the so much potential in that class for these ideas. And this is really learner as teacher. And learner as teacher through collaborative projects. So in this class, throughout the course, students are doing peer reviews of the individual stories, which students say is one of the most important aspects of the class. So they receive our feedback, but they're also receiving the feedback of their peers. We see a lot of activity. It's a fully online course, so we see a lot of activity in the Student Cafe, which is a really open-ended space where students are sharing ideas about, asking questions about a particular software program that they're having trouble with. And other students will jump in, and they have the answers before I have the answers. So they really are teaching each other, or they may have questions about the assignment and sort of their interpretation of the assignment. So it's really fascinating to see what happens in that space. And this course this year, I'm really doing it as an international collaboration, so that I have students from the United States, and Dr. Aird, who is our director for our European programs in Prague. She has been able to bring in students from Prague and Tirana into the course, so that the students in the end, we make sure that there's this international collaboration on the final digital storytelling projects. Again, I'll just show a very quick snippet of this, of research that students did into pandemic art.
The world is a funny place. Some areas of it are better than others at producing and appreciating great art. How is yours? In England, Scandinavia, or Canada, for example, musicians speak of stipends and state-funded art.
So this project was meticulously researched. They attributed every image that they used. Every image was open licensed. They added original music. They narrated it. They really worked together. They shared roles, and then to produce this work. So just fascinating what can happen when we bring all the students together collaboratively. They really taught each other. Trudy?
Thank you, Tom. So this last slide in this section, and then we'll just very quickly go through the last section. Publishing in Wikipedia, so the role of publisher. And this is just a quote from a student in the fall. So he said it gave one the feeling of contributing to something real and meaningful. And it was a very different experience than going into a 7-week course thinking they were going to do, some very basic library research and get nothing out of it. The students do find that it's really quite engaging, and that they're being able to select a lot of what they're doing is really helpful. So we're just going to very, very quickly share some resources we've created, and then hopefully we've been told this would go till noon, your time. So we hope there'll be time for you to ask questions, but we can also always respond on the Padlet. These are all open resources, and we invite you to use them. There's many more, and we love when people create others. So this next slide shows a little bit from the Metaliteracy module in an I Succeed online course. This is for first-year students. It's part of something put together by Lumen Learning, and it was adapted by the SUNY system, and it's in the SUNY systems version that there is a Metaliteracy module that includes all of the core components of Metaliteracy that you've heard about today. On the next slide, it mentions that there are 5 different outcomes. Each one is connected to a unit within it that can be incorporated into any course. And on the last slide in this particular I Succeed section, it tells you about the different formats that it's available in. If you're working with Lumen, there's the Waymaker version, which has all sorts of really wonderful learning enhancements that the students love. On the right, you can see there's exercises in our content, worksheets, activities, reflection, questions, and this is available for free on the site. So we encourage you to take a look at it. Tom, I'll turn it over to you now for the MOOC.
Sure, and then we just have a few more slides, and then we'll open it up. This is just kind of shows the structure of our most recent MOOC, Empowering Yourself in a Post-Truth World. It really is about building communities of trust. I just wrote about this for an article. You can read a closer analysis there. But the theme of that particular MOOC in dealing with the post-truth world is how do we build communities of trust? And that gets into that really civic engagement part of the model. And in terms of assessment, the final project for this really is asking students or participants, anyone who takes the MOOC, to develop a final digital project and then to participate in a closing discussion about it. So learners are producers. They create a digital artifact, and it could be anything related to themes from the course. They have an opportunity to conduct a peer review of other learners, and then they write a self-assessment in response to the discussion that happens at that closing. And these are just a few examples where, again, based on the themes of the course, we have participants who created a website about confirmation bias, an infographic about what it is to be meta-literate in social media environments, how to work against fake news and misinformation, and another confirmation bias website. So it's just fascinating the work that's coming out of this open MOOC. And then Trudy, do you want to talk about the badging, or do I talk about this part? Yeah, you mentioned the badging system. And this is really the kind of a screen shot of the Metaliteracy badging system, or actually the open content for the system, which we did make open. And then this is just a few slides that show how we've adapted that content ourselves from the open content, a self-direction badge that we created, to a course that I teach at Empire State College called Educational Planning, where students design their own degrees. And then this is another badge that Trudy has developed. And do you want to talk about this one, Trudy? Trudy, you're back?
I am.
Yeah, we have a little bit of a technical problem there. I had that earlier on. So I moved through the slides pretty quickly, and we're back. I hope that everyone can see these last few. Do you see that? Let's see. Can you see that the last one here on the expanded horizons?
So I can.
And then we probably should just open it up.
To questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
So this is the, again, going back to the Padlet, and I think we're just ready to open it up.
Yes, we are open now for questions. I'd like to thank you definitely for a wonderful conference, and for sharing your ideas, concepts, and your experiences, which I'm sure will broaden everyone's understanding of what these concepts mean and how they play out in the real day-to-day work with students. And how we can provide the possibilities so that students can engage in their own learning and in devising their own ways of learning about their learning processes, which is one of the outcomes that we are looking for. We are now open for questions. Estamos ahora abiertos para las preguntas que ustedes tengan, las pueden compartir en el chat. Además, quiero recordarles, por favor, que llenen el formulario de evaluación que está disponible también. Y los dejo entonces con la doctora Domínguez.
Saludos. Hasta el momento no tenemos preguntas a través del chat. Trudy, we don't have questions here. We don't know if you have questions on the Padlet.
Yes, we do. There was something that came in earlier under the ideas I'd like to share. And Tom, are you going to the, yes, okay.
Yeah, let's go to the Padlet. Can you see that? Sorry.
Right.
I'll go directly to the Padlet. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
So that social determinants of health, this person facilitates a seminar for first-year medicine students and is asking any ideas how I can work with the implicit bias that they bring. The first thought that comes to me is connected to what that political science professor is doing, is first sort of thinking about what bias they might have, and that might come through conversation with others in the class, hearing different opinions, and also reading different opinions about it. I don't know if you start out with scholarly articles, but I think that talking to others might help them to recognize that implicit bias. Tom, what do you think?
I think those are excellent suggestions. The other thing I was thinking about is this is where the metacognitive reflection can be so critical, and it could just be a few questions about that would, I guess, encourage students to reflect on bias that they might have. So really bring that
to information literacy and where information literacy was at that point. There's still some components that they have in common, but we didn't mention it in today's presentation, but literacy itself has shifted. So reading and writing really is not sufficient at this point to being able to interact with information competently. And so metaliteracy, sort of from the Greek, can be like after literacy or beyond literacy. And so it takes literacy further, but not as in perhaps as constricted a way as information literacy does.
Yeah, and I agree with everything Trudy just said. It's been an interesting journey because our work previously, was very grounded in information literacy, but in practice, I think that there is some, limits to it in terms of the kind of work we were doing with students as a learner, as producer, and certainly as the information environment has changed so much. So it's definitely, I think, grounded in those ideas, but it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And there are some key aspects that are clearly, resonate with, information literacy, the idea of critical thinking, self-direction, lifelong learning. But I think again, through the development of the idea, it's taken on these other dimensions, which again I think are still relatable to what information literacy is. But I do think there's a much stronger focus on the metacognitive. So even with the changes in the formal definitions of information literacy, I think metaliteracy has really taken that piece much further. And I think that even though there's now, in the information literacy definition, a focus on information producers, I think that is really central to metaliteracy. And I think this idea of expanding those roles and sort of foregrounding those in the learning experience is also another key part of it.
And I think some of what you were just saying, Tom, relates to that question that's right in front of you right now. So can literacy be for all people, including those who aren't tech savvy? And I think that it really is. I mean, there's certainly the component, because so much of information is mediated by the technology, but this idea of the roles, the learning domains, the characteristics, I think that even if somebody is not using technology as much or as adroitly as others, it still is relevant. Tom?
Perfectly said, and it's interesting. We talk about this quite a bit, this question, and I think that we do see it as for all people in all environments, because it is much more of a learning theory. I think early on, because there were such revolutionary changes in the information environment, we did try to highlight that in ways that, again, that original definition of information literacy was not doing. But we wouldn't want it to be kind of limited to that, because it's not a digital literacy, it's not media literacy. It is something else. Again, with that meta prefix, there's so much that can be explored with that. I think in many ways has been really kind of liberating for us to really think through these ideas because of the metacognitive piece and this idea that Trudy just mentioned about after. Sort of what comes after the literacy has always been considered sort of reading and writing, and in today's environment we need much more than that. But we also know that we need that. We need the reading and writing as sort of the baseline. So yeah, it really is. It is for everyone. We don't want the technology piece to limit it in any way, but at the same time, I think we know that in today's world, that would be quite a limitation if learners don't have the opportunity to ask critical questions about technology and to adapt to these rapidly changing environments, and maybe to make choices to sort of unplug from the technology, which a lot of people are doing, certainly with social media, because of the critical questions that people are asking about those proprietary social media applications. People are saying, I don't want to be engaged in those environments, but I think there are other kinds of ways to contribute.
Tom, just below that, there's another really good question. And I think this really depends. I think there are forces that are working towards this transition, sort of away from the banking model of education. I know with the open educational resources, there's a lot of movement towards those. And then, although they are not necessary for open pedagogy and they don't necessarily require open pedagogy, they're helping some people make the shift. So I think that that's one of the elements. Tom, what are you seeing?
I think that's an excellent point. I think I see a lot of, there's a lot of innovative work happening, clearly. I think even the ACRL redefinition of information literacy kind of really reflects these ideas in trying to shift beyond skills-based. But I still see kind of a skills-based approach quite a bit. I think in many ways, we're still trying to figure out what impact the pandemic is having on all of this, because the pandemic has really exposed a lot of divides. Everyone had to move online quickly, but it wasn't equal access for everyone. So everyone had to become a kind of online instructor and online student overnight because of this. And there's a lot of debates about the value of sort of online versus face-to-face, and sometimes it's this kind of binary, where I think what we really need is probably a blending of the two. And if we're thinking about online spaces, really trying to engage with that environment so that it is interactive, so it has a real social dimension. It's not just about sort of being on a Zoom screen. How can you best sort of leverage that time together? So a lot is happening, and I do think there's a lot of interest in these ideas, and I think these ideas connect to sort of other sort of trends that are happening in looking at literacy in different ways.
So I don't see any additional questions here. Are there any in the chat on YouTube?
And anyone can still add to the Padlet, because I don't know if I need to refresh that or not. I'll try that here.
And it's nice seeing the ideas that resonated with people as we were talking.
I wonder if I should also go back to the Mentimeter survey to see if that's expanded.
Sure, and I can keep an eye on the Padlet.
Yeah.
Just in case anybody else is adding anything.
Let's see here. I didn't. Let's see. I think that link is earlier on, so I'll move through this. Hope I'm not going.
I think it was right after.
Oh.
There it is.
Can you see it?
Yes.
All right. So let's see. Again, what does assessment of learning mean to you? Let's see if there's some phrases here. Wow.
And also, oh wow, it's really grown.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Trudy?
Oh, I was just going to say, for those who asked questions on the Padlet, if there was anything that we didn't really answer in connection with your question, you could add it back in your original question as a comment, and I'll see that.
Yeah, because we still have time if there are additional questions. And I know this is a lot of information for one day, but if there's something that wasn't, clear or that perhaps we could elaborate on, we'd certainly be happy to do that. And I'm not sure, Trudy, if there's anything that we kind of moved through quickly there that we wanted to go back to. We could always do that too.
I think maybe just seeing if anything else comes through, since we've looked sort of out of the flow of that.
Yeah.
But the slides will be available.
I'll go back now to the Padlet.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything else, and I'm assuming that since we're not able to see the YouTube chat, can it just be confirmed that there's nothing there?
No, there are no questions.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And can you see this, Trudy?
Yes. Do you want to mention the book, Tom?
Yeah, so we're putting the finishing touches on our new book, Metaliteracy in a Connected World, Developing Learners as Producers. And we're really excited about this. It will be coming out this year. This is the beautiful cover that ALA Neil Schumann has developed. We're just so excited. Our work with ALA has been just very rewarding, and all the covers have this, you can tell, this sort of circular diagrams they always echo in the graphics that they use. We're excited about the book because we really delve into this central role. The first chapter is really going to look at the metaliterate learner as producer in a connected world, and it's really grounded in learning theory. So it's going to be the sort of the most current discussion of the metaliteracy framework as it exists today. So obviously the idea has been developing since that first article in 2011, but we're really excited that this first chapter will really engage with sort of kind of in a way representing the model. There will be several case studies related to even things we discussed today. So I'll be just going through an analysis of a few of my courses, and then Trudy, I don't know if you want to give quick summaries of your contributions as well, because you'll be talking about open pedagogy is one of your chapters.
Yeah, so a much more of a deep dive into open pedagogy and this connection with metaliteracy. There's sections on how the two align with the idea of a learner as producer in 2 of my courses and 2 other courses where I work with the professors. And then the last chapter in the book is going to include a variety of activities that could be adapted for any course that focus on things such as critical thinking and a growth mindset and digital citizenship in connection with, again, metaliteracy and the idea of a learner as producer. So we're very, very excited about this book. And we'd also just again like to say thank you very much for inviting us and having a chance to chat and seeing all of the things that you've put on the Padlet and the Mentimeter. It expands our thinking. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And we will make the slides available on metaliteracy.org. If I believe that this is being recorded, so we'll link to that as well. Definitely follow us on metaliteracy.org. Follow us on Twitter with the hashtag metaliteracy, and also our at Tom Maki and at PBK Trudy. And thank you so much. We're really thrilled to be here today.
Thank you. This has been a great experience, and be able to share ideas and questions and hearing your answers and all this new information for many of us. So I'm sure that all the participants were able to learn about all these new concepts that we have to learn each day. To the participants, remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel and remember to complete the evaluation so you can receive your certificate. The evaluation will be available up to 2 hours after we finish this presentation. So Dr. Thomas Maki and Trudy Jacobson, thank you for your time. This has been great to hear all this information. I will be waiting for the book to be able to read and keep learning about this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.